Our underreported story segment tonight. Last week, we covered the story of the Ohio parents who lost custody of their teenage daughter after she told them she was transgender and wanted to take hormones and have surgery, and they said no, not until you're an adult. We talked about the precedent this ruling sets and the slippery slope of allowing government to step in when parents make decisions for their children that their children don't like. But today we're going to focus specifically on the idea of changing genders. The media is portraying these parents as intolerant for not facilitating this process, but research shows that gender reassignment surgery might not be the best way to treat gender dysphoria, and the consequences could be catastrophic. With me now, senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and author of When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment, Dr. Ryan Anderson. Dr. Anderson, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be with you.
All right, Dr. Anderson, I just started reading your book this weekend. So far, excellent. Highly recommend. I haven't read a book like this before. I think yours might be the first in its field. So start out by telling us about your book.
Sure. It's a play on the title of When Harry Met Sally, because a generation ago, we were debating whether or not men and women can be just friends. And now today, we're debating whether or not men can become women, whether boys can become girls. The best biology, psychology, and philosophy reveal that sex is a bodily reality and gender is a manifestation of our bodily sex. Biology isn't bigotry. And parents need to know the truth about the human person and the human body and not accept some of the radical claims that gender experts are making on behalf of science and medicine.
Right, and it's not just gender experts. I mean, we're seeing this playing out in courts. Like I mentioned in the introduction, we covered extensively that story from Ohio last week where that judge literally took a child away from her parents because the parents had researched medically and decided that they did not feel that that was the best way to treat their daughter's gender dysphoria. And that's what I want to ask you. When I was debating a liberal about this topic, she was arguing that, listen, this is a medical consensus. This is the same thing as if a parent denied chemotherapy to their daughter if the daughter had cancer. And my brief research, I'm sure, is not as extensive as yours. It doesn't seem to be that there is medical consensus about this being the best way to treat children with gender dysphoria. What can you tell us?
Of course, there's no medical consensus in favor of putting kids on puberty-blocking drugs or giving testosterone to girls. In fact, this is entirely experimental. Although they've been able to capture some of the medical associations to say that they're officially in favor of it, there's no rigorous long-term scientific research on what even the long-term outcomes are for placing kids on these drugs. So how could anyone claim that there's a consensus that doing these experiments on children is actually good medicine? We need to hit the pause button. We need to tap the brakes. We need to think more critically about what we're doing in the name of science and medicine for kids who are struggling with their identity.
Right, and my big question here, I guess, is this curative? And there is a difference to me in treating children with gender dysphoria and treating adults. Adults can make their own decisions. If they want to do this and undergo this treatment, we live in a free country, they're free to do that. But children undergoing this treatment, first of all, the idea, I mean, some people claim it's even abusive to children because, and I believe you can speak to this statistic, some very overwhelming majority, a very high number of children who suffer from gender disorders or dysphorias get over them. They grow out of them by the time they are adults.
Yeah, you're hitting on a very important distinction. America's a free country, and so if Bruce wants to be Caitlin, he's free to make his own choices. But with children, we need to be a little bit more protective and recognize that children aren't as mature. We don't let children make any other life-altering decisions. Why would we let them fundamentally change their bodies when, as you point out, 80 to 95% of children with gender dysphoria naturally grow out of it? I have an entire chapter in the book that just goes through case study after case study of how a child with gender dysphoria was treated by a therapist and eventually grew out of it. We need to be promoting these sorts of therapeutic responses, not rushing to embrace the gender ideologues who are saying puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are the way to go.
Right, and the shocking thing to me is that transgender activists, first of all, don't talk about that statistic. 80 to 95% of children outgrow their gender dysphoria. They also never mention that puberty-blocking hormone drugs are not FDA approved. Like you said, they are experimental. They are not, there's no medical consensus that they are curative. In the vein of this treatment being curative, though, I want to talk about the suicide rates, particularly because of that case in Ohio last week, where the lawyer for this girl who wants to transition to be a boy basically threatened if this girl doesn't get this surgery, if she doesn't get these hormones, she will commit suicide. We want to play music at her graduation, not at her funeral. Is that a medically ethical reason for someone to undergo major surgery because they're threatening to commit suicide? Because it seems to me most doctors actually push off major surgeries if there's some kind of psychiatric issue underlying.
Exactly. And the judge didn't accept that argument. It's really interesting that though the judge awarded custody to the grandparents, the judge explicitly said we're not going to allow children to just threaten suicide anytime they want to get rid of their parents and their custody of the parents. If a child is suffering from depression, you want to first address what are the root causes of that depression, of that anxiety, of that a form of mental unhealth before rushing into transforming the body into something that it isn't. So many of the doctors that I spoke with and that I quote in this book analogize gender dysphoria to other types of body image problems, like anorexia. And they say you don't address therapy at the body, you address therapy at the thoughts and the feelings to help people feel comfortable in their bodies.
Right, and I think, too, it's important. You make this point in your book, and I think it's a really good point, that we need to kind of segment this conversation into two different parts. One part, talking about these children who have legitimate psychiatric diagnosis. We need to treat them with compassion. We need to do everything that we can to help them become mentally healthy again, and that's one segment of it. But the other segment is sort of these activists that have latched on to what you call the transgender ideology here. But this ideology in and of itself, what they're arguing for at the basis is self-contradictory, if you will, hypocritical. Because on one hand, they claim that their true self is wholly different from their physical body. That's why they need to change their sex, change their gender. But they also say a change in their physical body is necessary to become their true self. And I mean, you can't have it both ways, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a whole section of the book that just goes through all of the philosophical contradictions in the transgender worldview. Because as you point out, they want to say on the one hand, the real self is something other than the physical body, but then simultaneously say only physical bodies exist. Many of these people are materialists. So if it were only our physical body, how can I be trapped in the wrong physical body? What is the me that is trapped in the wrong physical body? Many of them say gender is purely a social construct. But then in that case, how could I be trapped in the wrong social construct? We need to have a better understanding of what it means to have a sexed body, and then also a better understanding of what the proper understanding of gender is. Much of this just seems to be building off of bad gender stereotypes. So that if you're a boy who plays with dolls or a girl who plays with trucks, you might actually be trapped in the wrong body. Why can't we just say boys can play with dolls, girls can play with trucks? You're not transgender. We can have a much better understanding of both sex and gender if we do this.
Right, and I think this is what happens when political correctness or progressive ideology creeps into medicine, and it's kind of scary because it's not based off of scientific evidence. It's based off of an ideology, a political ideology. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I encourage all of our viewers, go read his book. It's great.